When an election completely shocks the establishment, when a populist wave sweeps across borders, like the vote for Brexit or the rise of Trump, is the real story purely about struggling factory workers?
Or is it something deeper, a kind of hidden war over who gets to define a nation's culture and its very identity?
That is the incredibly compelling and I think deeply disruptive question at the heart of the research we're diving into today.
It really is. Welcome to the deep dive, customized just for you.
Today, we are immersing ourselves in Pippa Norris's highly influential cultural backlash thesis. We're looking at how she uses massive cross-national data to reframe the political turmoil of the last decade.
And this is more than just a summary. We're applying an extended analysis format, one we hope helps you read with sharper insight and really greater discernment.
Exactly. Enjoy a bold new take on book coverage with this extended analysis. It's more than just a summary, though we include that too. This feature examines how the author shapes an argument, builds influence,
Then earns, or in some cases, loses your trust.
giving you the tools to read with sharper insight. Should you read this book, this should definitely help. It's also excellent for any aspiring writers out there.
Absolutely. And if you find this expanded format valuable, we'd love to hear from you. Your feedback really helps guide our future content.
And for the next few minutes, you're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for a deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
Okay, so let's get into it. Let's unpack Norris's core argument. It starts with a very precise definition of the political force she's tracking.
She calls it authoritarian populism. So what exactly does that mean?
Well, it's defined by a fusion of two very distinct elements. First, you have the standard populist style.
The idea that a small group of pure people are being betrayed by corrupt elites.
That's the engine of the anger, exactly. But then there's the second part.
The authoritarian
Preference. And this isn't just anger, it's a whole belief system. It's a strong desire for order, for hierarchy, and for strict conformity to traditional norms.
So it implies a preference for these powerful, singular leaders who are willing to enforce one vision of society, often at the expense of minority rights.
Precisely. And this leads directly to her core backlash claim. She argues that the rise of parties like UKIP in Britain or the National Rally in France reflects a kind of cultural counter-revolution.
A counter-revolution against what, specifically?
Against the long, slow expansion of liberal, cosmopolitan, and what sociologists call post-material values, a shift that really began after the 1960s.
We hear that term post-material a lot in political science. What does that transition actually mean for the average person?
It means that as Western societies achieved broad economic security after World War II, the values of the generations that followed began to shift.
So instead of prioritizing immediate things like food, shelter, safety,
Younger, often wealthier generations began prioritizing things like self-expression, environmentalism, gender equality, and international cooperation.
so the backlash is essentially traditional, older, and often conservative groups reacting defensively against that value shift. They see changes in immigration, multiculturalism, and minority rights not as progress, but as a direct threat.
A threat to their status and their vision of the national identity.
Yes. And this is the point where Norris fundamentally shifts the causal weight away from the standard economic story.
For decades, the analysis was always focused on the left behind, right? The factory workers, the victims of deindustrialization.
And the Norris framework doesn't dismiss that pain at all, but it puts it in a very different context.
It demotes it, in a way.
It does. The book views economic inequality primarily as an accelerant to cultural grievances, not the primary engine of support. The core struggle, which her data supports, is over whose values define the political community.
Not just whose wallet is emptiest.
Exactly. And that reframing helps us explain this huge pattern that the traditional economic model just can't account for.
Which is why affluent welfare states, countries with extremely strong safety nets like Denmark, Sweden, the Netherlands, are seeing the strongest gains for these authoritarian populist parties.
They aren't economically left behind, but the cultural anxiety is still driving major political change.
What's fascinating here is the sheer power of the data she marshals to solidify this. The logos of her argument. Norris relies heavily on detailed cross-national data, using things like the European Social Survey.
And what does that data show specifically?
It shows that the cultural indicators, things like a high score on authoritarian values, moral traditionalism, strongly anti-immigration attitudes, these more consistently predict support for these movements.
Than traditional economic variables like unemployment or income alone.
That's the key. She doesn't just assert this, she tests it directly. Let's use Brexit as the key example, since it's such a powerful case study in the book.
So how does the cultural backlash lens explain the UK's decision to leave the European Union?
Well, it connects the Leave vote primarily to those deeply embedded authoritarian and populist attitudes, especially within social conservatives and older groups.
They perceived EU integration, which of course facilitates free movement and promotes multiculturalism, as a kind of existential threat to British identity.
It became less about trade and more about restoring a traditional sense of self.
And you can't talk about Brexit without talking about the role of UKIP, a relatively small party that achieved a massive political outcome.
She highlights what she calls UKIP's critical blackmail role. This party was incredibly effective at leveraging intense anti-immigration, anti-elite rhetoric.
And that pressure essentially forced the mainstream Conservative Party to call the referendum.
It did, and in doing so, it completely reframed the national debate around core cultural anxieties, sovereignty, borders, and that very emotionally charged idea of taking back control.
That reframing is key. It became a cultural battleground dressed up as an economic choice. And the data from that time was pretty unambiguous on this.
It really was. Analysis of the European Social Survey data showed that measures of social conservatism were far more powerful statistical predictors of a pro-Brexit vote than the traditional economic variables.
So for every tick up in anti-immigrant sentiment, the probability of voting Leave just rose significantly.
Yes, often outweighing the impact of someone's individual financial insecurity.
Okay, we've established the core argument. But for those aspiring to write for influence, the real question is, how did Norris convince the academic world that this argument holds water? Let's turn to her authorial strategy.
This is where the book really shines as a model for analytical writing. If we look at scholarly credibility, or ethos, Norris projects authority through sheer scale.
She doesn't just rely on a single country or a single election.
No, she leans on extensive comparative data sets, covering over 24 countries and hundreds of parties, making the patterns almost undeniable. She's showing the robustness of the finding across very diverse systems.
And she connects it all back to established social science.
Precisely. To that long-standing value change theory we mentioned earlier, this gives the whole argument deep historical and theoretical roots. It makes it much harder to just dismiss as a fleeting observation.
What about the logic, the logos? How does she structure the argument to make her evidence feel conclusive?
Her strategy really foregrounds clear conceptual distinctions. She carefully separates populism from authoritarianism and cultural cleavages from economic ones.
So she can show that while a poor voter might support a populist party focused on redistribution,
it's the authoritarian component, that desire for order and tradition, that drives the vote toward parties that specifically restrict minority rights. That precision prevents blurring the causes.
and the regression analysis she uses, what does that contribute rhetorically?
It's the ultimate proof point. By using these transparent models, she's testing competing explanations directly against each other. She can literally publish a table showing that even when you account for income and education, cultural variables still have superior predictive power.
She allows the numbers to test the economic hypothesis and show its relative weakness. It's a powerful appeal to hard reason.
It is, and then there is the emotional appeal, the pathos. This is subtle, but I found her restrained approach to be highly effective.
I agree. Her goal is clearly to persuade a skeptical, academic, and policy audience not to win a cable news debate.
Absolutely. She uses sober, analytic prose, not moralistic rhetoric, while she occasionally issues a necessary warning that this can corrode liberal democratic principles.
Like minority protection and institutional checks.
The tone remains high and rational. It's a deliberate rhetorical choice, contrasting her measured appeal with the emotional, often hyperbolic rhetoric of the populists she's studying.
That measured approach is a key lesson for any policy analyst.
Before we move on, I want to take a brief mindful moment. If you want to see this kind of strategic analysis applied to other foundational works, check out Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all inspiring reflection and rational thought.
Now, let's look at the normative implications. If we accept this cultural thesis, why does it matter for those committed to defending democracy, freedom, and equality?
This is perhaps the most valuable political contribution of the framework. It gives us a necessary analytical tool to distinguish between legitimate democratic arguments over policy,
Like arguing over tax rates.
and the dangerous erosion of liberal democratic guardrails.
That is the critical difference. A party arguing for lower taxes is democratic. A party arguing to sideline the judiciary or silence a minority group is something else entirely.
It is. When a movement acts solely in the name of a homogenous people and aggressively targets institutions like judicial independence or the free press, it ceases to be standard democratic competition. It becomes an assault on fundamental liberal institutions.
But no academic framework is perfect, and we owe it to you, the listener, to provide a balanced perspective. What are the major criticisms raised by other scholars?
One key critique is about what's called causal blurring. Reviewers argue that the framework sometimes underspecifies the exact causal pathway.
Meaning, why does just holding an authoritarian value necessarily translate into casting a vote for that kind of party?
Exactly. The mechanism between belief and ballot box can be messy, and critics say the book sometimes blurs the distinctions among different kinds of populist parties.
That's a fair challenge to the precision of the model. And what about the biggest challenge? The idea that economics and culture are just too entangled to be separated so neatly.
That's the powerful entanglement argument. Critics contend that material insecurity, the economic issue, can directly generate these cultural threat perceptions.
For example, if you live in a deindustrialized town and feel your economic status is plummeted, you also experience a deep sense of status loss.
Which then makes you highly susceptible to narratives that blame external cultural forces like immigrants or cosmopolitan elites for both your economic decline and your perceived loss of status.
Right. In that view, the cultural backlash isn't a completely independent force. It's a reaction to that decline.
The two narratives feed each other constantly, and critics argue the model risks minimizing the very real economic pain that opened the door for cultural grievance in the first place.
So, synthesizing all this for the listener, what's the big takeaway? Norris's book provides a powerful reframing of contemporary political turmoil.
It sees it less as a pure economic revolt and more as a defensive mobilization by culturally threatened groups.
It tells us that this political battle is rooted in deep value polarization. As liberal cosmopolitan norms continue to diffuse, those attached to traditional nationalist visions are mobilizing defensively.
This isn't a battle about marginal tax rates. It's about the soul of the nation.
Which leaves us with a provocative final thought for you to mull over. Since the book argues that populism is fundamentally a symptom of this deep value polarization, what non-economic, cultural, or institutional strategies should liberal democracies adopt to specifically counter the erosion of minority rights and pluralist checks?
If money isn't the cure, what is the strategy for preserving liberal institutions? A profound challenge that the framework pushes us all to consider.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Subscribe and nourish your mind on the go.